They called him the architect of shadows. Jang Tae-Hyuk was a man who moved through Seoul with the cold, predatory focus of a shark in shallow water, owning the judges, the streets, and the very heartbeat of the city. To the world, he was an enigma of iron discipline, a man without a pulse, and certainly without a weakness. But at a high society masquerade, where the elite dressed in silk to pretend they were saints, the world was about to discover his only tether to humanity: his mother, Madame Han Soo-jin. As the room watched in a sickening, breathless silence, a wealthy socialite splashed a glass of red wine across the elderly woman's silver hair, forcing the confused, fragile mother to her knees to beg for forgiveness. And Tae-Hyuk, the man who could destroy everyone in that room, did the one thing no one expected. He said nothing. He simply watched from the shadows, his hands relaxed at his sides, as the lamb was savaged by the wolf. He waited until a woman with no status and everything to lose, a black maid named Amara Nwoye, did the unthinkable. She stepped between the predator and the prey. This is the story of how a woman the world ignored saved the mother of the man the world feared. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel smelled of rare orchids, vintage cognac, and a deep, underlying rot. High above the floor, the architect of shadows watched as the power in the room shifted, not to a billionaire, but to the woman in the apron who was shielding a broken mother. They called him the architect of shadows, a name whispered in the humid back alleys of Itaewon and the sterile boardrooms of Gangnam with the same bone-chilling reverence. Jang Tae-Hyuk did not merely inhabit Seoul, he owned its pulse. He was a man of obsidian edges and clinical silence, an enigma who had traded his humanity for a throne built on iron discipline and secrets. To the public, he was the untouchable chairman of a global logistics empire, but to those who moved in the dark, he was the final word, a predator who controlled the judges, the police, and the very air the city breathed. His life was a masterpiece of cold calculation, a world where every smile was a contract and every silence was a threat. Yet within the reinforced glass walls of his penthouse fortress, the architect's shadow softened. Beneath the layers of tailored black silk and the weight of 1,000 sins lay his only tether to the world he had long ago forsaken, Madame Han Soo-jin. To the world, she was the matriarch of a dynasty, but to Tae-Hyuk, she was a fading star. Time had not been kind to Soo-jin. It had begun to fray the edges of her mind, leaving her drifting in a sea of fractured memories and sudden, heartbreaking disorientation. In the quiet hours before dawn, the most feared man in Korea would sit at her bedside, his predatory gaze turning remarkably tender as she reached out to touch his face, her eyes searching for a son she sometimes struggled to recognize. "Tae-Hyuk, she would whisper, her voice like brittle parchment. "Is it time for school?" He would take her frail, papery hand in his, hands that had broken rivals without a second thought, and nod slowly. "Not yet, mother. Rest. The world is quiet today." But the world was never quiet for a man like Tae-Hyuk. Even as he shielded her from the rot of his empire, the rot was beginning to seep through the cracks. His rivals, led by the venomous Choi Min-seo, were tired of the ghost's shadow. They looked for a crack in the obsidian, a single blemish in the steel. They didn't see a powerful CEO. They saw a man burdened by a weakness that wore a beige cardigan and carried the scent of jasmine and fatting youth. For months, Tae-Hyuk had kept her hidden, a precious relic of a life he no longer deserved. He built his walls higher, his security tighter, believing that if he could just control the light, the darkness would never find her. He didn't realize that the most dangerous traps aren't set in the alleys, but in the most opulent ballrooms, where the wine flows like blood and the wolves wear the faces of friends. As the date of the Shilla Hotel gala approached, Tae-Hyuk felt the pressure of the city's expectations. He had to show his face. He had to project the image of the unyielding king. And Soo-jin, in a rare moment of clarity, had insisted on joining him, wanting to stand by her son one last time before the fog claimed her completely. He agreed, a rare lapse in judgment fueled by a son's lingering hope. He believed his reputation alone would be her armor. He believed no one would dare touch the ghost's mother. He was wrong. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and the architect of shadows was about to walk into a masterpiece of humiliation. The Shilla Hotel's grand ballroom was a cathedral of fractured gold and hollow laughter, a place where the scent of rare orchids struggled to mask the metallic tang of social ambition. Beneath the weight of massive crystal chandeliers, the elite of Seoul drifted like colorful reef fish, their diamonds catching the light in a way that felt more like a warning than a welcome. At the center of this swirling opulence stood Madame Han Soo-jin. In her simple, peach-colored hanbok, she looked like a delicate pressed flower accidentally dropped into a cage of tropical birds. The fog had settled over her mind early in the evening, leaving her eyes wide and searching, her fingers nervously pleating the silk of her skirt as she looked for a familiar face in a sea of painted masks. Choi Min-seo, the daughter of a rival shipping magnate and a woman whose heart was as cold as the industrial diamonds on her throat, saw the opening. She didn't see an elderly woman in distress. She saw a way to draw blood from the ghost. With a calculated tilt of her hand, Min-seo let her glass of heavy Cabernet slip. The deep red liquid didn't just spill. It bloomed like a violent wound across Soo-jin's silver hair and ivory shoulder. The room went unnervingly silent, the music continuing to play a ghostly waltz that no one was listening to anymore. "Oh, heavens," Min-seo's voice sliced through the quiet, dripping with a theatrical, cruel pity. "I am so sorry, madam, but perhaps if you weren't wandering around like a lost child, you wouldn't be underfoot. Look at my dress. It's ruined. Don't you think an apology is in order, or has the great architect's mother forgotten her manners along with everything else?" Soo-jin gasped, her hands flying to her stained hair, the red wine dripping onto the polished marble like slow, rhythmic heartbeats. She looked up, her lower lip trembling, the humiliation of the moment piercing through her confusion. She dropped to her knees, not out of duty, but out of a sudden, panicked instinct to clean the mess, to disappear, to stop the laughing eyes that were now boring into her from every corner of the room. High on the shadowed mezzanine, Jang Tae-Hyuk stood as still as a gargoyle carved from obsidian. His gaze was pinned on the scene below, his eyes two dark voids of clinical focus. Every person in the room expected the doors to burst open, for his security detail to descend like a plague, for the ghost to scream. But he did nothing. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, his fingers not even twitching toward the phone in his pocket. To the onlookers, it looked like the ultimate betrayal, the son abandoning the mother to the wolves to protect a fragile political truce. The air in the ballroom grew heavy, a suffocating vacuum where mercy should have been. Min-seo leaned down, her shadow falling over the weeping woman on the floor. "Tell me, Madame Han," she whispered loud enough for the front row to hear, "is your son too busy counting his blood money to teach you how to walk in public? Perhaps you should beg for my forgiveness on behalf of both of you." Tae-Hyuk's pulse didn't quicken. He watched the lamb being savaged by the wolf with a terrifying, unreadable patience. He wasn't waiting for a miracle. He was waiting for a soul. And in the service line, hidden behind a silver tray and a white apron, Amara Nwoye felt something in her chest snap. She saw the most powerful man in the city standing in his tower of silence, and she realized that if the king wouldn't move, the nobody would have to. The silence in the ballroom had become a physical weight, a vacuum where the dignity of a human being was being systematically dismantled for sport. Amara Nwoye stood at the edge of the service line, her fingers white-knuckled against the silver tray she held. She looked up at the mezzanine, searching for the man they called the architect, but Jang Tae-Hyuk remained a shadow among shadows, his inaction a cold betrayal that made the bile rise in her throat. She looked down at Madame Han, whose tears were mixing with the vintage Cabernet on the marble floor, and in that moment, the invisible walls of status and fear that had governed Amara's life in Seoul simply evaporated. Amara didn't walk. She moved with a sudden, rhythmic grace that cut through the stagnant air. Before Choi Min-seo could utter another syllable of her rehearsed cruelty, a hand, firm, dark, and steady, reached out and caught the socialite's wrist mid-gesture. The gasp that rippled through the room was audible, a collective intake of breath at the sight of a servant touching a goddess. Amara didn't let go. She stepped into the light of the central chandelier, placing her body like a living shield between the kneeling mother and the standing wolf. Her upright posture and calm, focused expression radiated a quiet strength that made the diamonds on Min-seo's neck seem like cheap glass. "That is enough," Amara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that carried to the furthest corners of the hall, vibrating even in the rafters where Tae-Hyuk watched. Min Seo's face contorted, her shock curdling into a high-pitched rage. "How dare you? Do you have any idea who I am? You are a nothing, a blemish. Take your hands off me before I have you erased from this city." Amara didn't flinch. She looked Min Seo directly in the eyes, her gaze reflecting the fractured gold of the chandeliers with an unwavering moral fire. "I know exactly who you are," Amara replied, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "You are a woman so small that you must stand on the neck of a mother to feel tall. You speak of ruins and apologies, but look down." Amara gestured to the wine-soaked floor where Madame had sat trembling. "The only thing that belongs on this floor is your pride. It is the only thing here that is truly beneath us." With a gentle but firm motion, Amara knelt, ignoring the heiress entirely. She took the white silk napkin from her apron and began to pat the wine from Soo-jin's silver hair, her touch as soft as a prayer. "It's all right, mother," she whispered, using the honorific with a warmth that felt like a localized sun in that frozen room. "You don't need to beg. The lions here are just cats in expensive silk." Above them, on the obsidian mezzanine, the architect of shadows felt a sensation he hadn't experienced in 20 years, his pulse. He watched as the woman the world ignored did what he, with all his billions and his blood-stained power, had been too paralyzed to do. He saw the way Amara held his mother's hand, a silent covenant formed in the face of 100 enemies. The political deadlock that had kept him motionless snapped like dry kindling. Tae-Hyuk didn't descend the stairs. He reclaimed the room with his presence, his eyes fixed not on his rivals, but on the maid who had just taught a king the meaning of courage. The masquerade was over. The true power in the Shilla Hotel no longer wore a suit, it wore an apron. The aftermath of the gala felt like a funeral for the old world. In the wake of Amara's defiance, Jang Tae-Hyuk had descended from his mezzanine like a dark tide, his silence finally breaking into a series of clinical, devastating commands that cleared the room of its elite scavengers. He didn't look at Choi Min-seo as his security detail escorted her out, her social standing evaporating with every step. His focus was entirely on the two women huddled on the marble floor, the fragile mother he loved and the stranger who had dared to protect her. 3 hours later, the neon hum of Seoul felt a world away from Amara's cramped basement apartment in Itaewon. The walls were thin enough to hear the city's restless breathing, and the air smelled of damp concrete and the cheap jasmine soap she used to scrub away the stains of other people's lives. She was packing a meager bag, certain that her career in the service industry had ended the moment she touched a socialite's wrist, when a long, black sedan pulled up to the curb. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the neighborhood. Tae-Hyuk stepped into her small living space, his tailored suit a sharp, obsidian contrast to the peeling wallpaper. He didn't apologize for the intrusion. He simply stood there, his presence filling the room until the ceiling felt too low. He looked at her small pile of books and the single photo of her own mother back in Lagos, his unreadable eyes taking in the evidence of a life lived in the shadows. "You risked everything for a woman who doesn't even know your name," Tae-Hyuk said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the window pane. "In a city of 300 guests, you were the only one who saw a human being instead of a target." Amara stood tall, refusing to be intimidated by the man the world feared. "I didn't do it for you, Mr. Jang. I did it because she was someone's mother, and she was hurting." Tae-Hyuk stepped closer, pulling a small, heavy card from his pocket, an obsidian slate with his personal seal embossed in silver. "My mother's mind is a labyrinth, Amara. She is surrounded by people who see her as a chess piece or a chore. I need a shadow, not a guard and not a servant, but a soul that cannot be bought." He laid the card on her scarred wooden table. "I am offering you a path of loyalty. You will move into the manor. You will be her constant, her protector, and her voice when the fog grows too thick. In return, the gates of this city will open for you. Your education, your future, I will build them from the ground up." Amara looked at the card, then at the man whose eyes held a flicker of a vulnerability he couldn't quite mask. It wasn't just a job offer. It was an enlistment into a war she hadn't started. She realized then that leaving this room meant leaving her invisibility behind forever. "I don't work for ghosts," she said quietly, meeting his predatory gaze with her own steady fire. If I go, I work for her. A ghost of a smile touched Tae-Hyuk's lips, the first sign of life she had seen in the architect of shadows. That is exactly why I'm here. By dawn, the basement was empty. Amara sat in the back of the sedan as it climbed the winding roads toward the glass and steel fortress on the hill. She was leaving the safety of the shadows to enter the belly of the beast, traded from a life of quiet struggle to a world of obsidian luxury and lethal secrets. The contract was signed in silence, and as the heavy iron gates of the Tae-Hyuk estate swung shut behind her, Amara knew there was no turning back. She was no longer a maid. She was a guardian of the ghost's heart. The transition from the damp, breathing walls of Itaewon to the clinical perfection of the Tae-Hyuk estate was not a promotion. It was a relocation to the eye of a storm. The manor sat atop the highest hill in Seoul, a jagged monolith of black glass and reinforced steel that seemed to watch the city with the same predatory detachment as its master. Inside, the air was filtered to a surgical purity, and the silence was so heavy it felt pressurized. Amara Nwoye soon realized that her path of loyalty was paved with invisible tripwires. Every corridor was a gauntlet of high-definition cameras, and every servant she passed in the halls wore a mask of polite, terrifying neutrality. By the third day, the reality of her position settled in like a cold fever. She wasn't just a caregiver, she was a living provocation. In the eyes of the Park Syndicate and the displaced socialites of the Shilla Gala, Amara was the glitch in the ghost's armor. She was the only person allowed to touch the architect's mother, the only one who sat with Madame Han in the sun-drenched atrium, reading stories of ancient kings, while the elderly woman's fingers traced the patterns on Amara's skin with a childlike wonder. Because Amara held the key to Tae-Hyuk's heart, she had unknowingly stepped into the crosshairs of an entire underworld. The first warning came in the kitchen, a space of gleaming industrial chrome where the staff moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. As Amara prepared a tray of herbal tea for Madame Han, the head chef, a man with eyes as hard as flint, leaned in close. His voice was a jagged whisper. You think the obsidian card makes you untouchable. In this house, the higher you climb, the further the fall. You are a blemish on a masterpiece, girl, and masterpieces have a way of being cleaned. Amara didn't flinch, but as she walked back to the private wing, she noticed the subtle shifts in the manor's atmosphere. A security guard whose gaze lingered a second too long on her throat. A maid who accidentally left a cleaning solution near Madame Han's medicine that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. The fortress was no longer a sanctuary. It was a maze of high-tech surveillance and ancient, venomous jealousies. Jang Tae-Hyuk was rarely seen, a phantom presence felt only through the tightening of security protocols and the occasional scent of expensive tobacco in the hallway. Yet, Amara felt his eyes on her through the monitors, watching to see if his gamble would break. She realized then that she was the most targeted woman in the country. A human shield in an invisible war. Every meal she served was a potential assassination attempt. Every shadow in the garden was a possible breach. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the atrium, watching the city lights flicker below like a sea of distant stars. Behind her, Madame Han slept fitfully, clutching a silk pillow. Amara reached into the pocket of her new, high-collared uniform and felt the sharp edge of the obsidian card. She wasn't a maid anymore, and she wasn't just a companion. She was a soldier in a war of silk and shadows, and the hunters were already at the gate. The world that had ignored her now wanted her dead, but as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. The crosshairs were locked, but Amara Nwoye was no longer a stationary target. The midnight air inside the manor was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive coldness, a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. Amara moved through the darkened corridors with the practiced stealth of a woman who had spent her life navigating the periphery of other people's power. She was headed to the private study to retrieve a forgotten book for Madame Han, but as she approached the heavy obsidian doors, she saw a sliver of amber light bleeding onto the marble floor. She pushed the door open, the hinges moving with a clinical, silent precision. Inside, the architect of shadows was no longer the untouchable king of Seoul's underworld. Jang Tae-Hyuk sat slumped in a high-backed leather chair, his tailored jacket discarded on the floor like a piece of useless armor. In his hand was a small, silver-framed photograph, its glass catching the fractured light of a single desk lamp. The sound that filled the room was one Amara hadn't expected to hear in this fortress. The ragged, suffocating hitch of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Tae-Hyuk was weeping, not with the loud grief of the dramatic, but with the silent, tectonic shifting of a man whose internal foundations were collapsing. His shoulders shook, and his predatory eyes were clouded with a saul-trimmed despair as he stared at the image of a much younger Madam Han holding a small, laughing boy by the seaside. Amara stood in the doorway, her presence a quiet ripple in his sea of grief. She didn't turn away. She didn't offer the hollow comfort of a servant. She walked toward him, her footsteps light but purposeful. Tae-Hyuk didn't look up, even as she came to a halt beside his desk. "She doesn't remember the beach, Amara," he whispered, his voice a jagged shadow of its usual authority. "She looked at me tonight and asked if I was the man coming to fix the pipes. I own the city, I have bought the loyalty of the powerful and the silence of the dead, yet I cannot buy back a single minute of my mother's mind." He gripped the frame so hard his knuckles turned white. "This is my punishment. For every life I've broken, she loses a piece of me." Amara reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it firmly on his trembling shoulder. It was the same steady, grounding touch she had used at the Shilla Gala, the touch of someone who saw the man beneath the monster. "You think this is a debt you're paying," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of the sun into his obsidian office. "But grief is not a transaction, Mr. Jang. You are holding yourself hostage in a cage of your own making." Tae-Hyuk finally looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion and raw vulnerability. "I have no room for mercy. Mercy is a luxury for those who don't have empires to defend." "That's where you're wrong," Amara replied, her eyes reflecting the amber light with an unwavering moral clarity. "Mercy isn't just for the people you forgive. Mercy is for yourself. You are so busy being the ghost that you've forgotten you're allowed to be the boy in that picture. She may be losing her memory, but she hasn't lost her love. She doesn't need a king. She needs a son who isn't afraid to hurt." For a long minute, the only sound was the hum of the high-tech security systems. Then, slowly, Tae-Hyuk's grip on the frame relaxed. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 20 years. In that darkened study, the architect of shadows allowed himself to be seen, and for the first time, the walls of the fortress felt less like a cage and more like a home. He looked at Amara, not as a contract or a shadow, but as the only person who had ever dared to offer him the one thing his billions couldn't buy, the permission to be human. The air in the manor's kitchen usually hummed with the clinical rhythm of a laboratory, but tonight, the silence felt curdled. Amara stepped into the gleaming expanse of stainless steel and industrial chrome, her senses heightened by the weight of the obsidian card in her pocket and the memory of Tae-Hyuk's tears in the study. She was there to prepare Madam Han's nightly ritual, a pot of chamomile tea to quiet the ghosts of her fading memory. As she reached for the antique porcelain teapot, a scent drifted past her that didn't belong in a sanctuary of herbs and honey. It was faint, a sharp, metallic tang hidden beneath the steam, like the ghost of a bitter almond. Cyanide. Amara froze, her gaze shifting to the head chef's station. The man who usually moved with the precision of a surgeon was gone, replaced by a line cook she didn't recognize, a man whose movements were too heavy, his eyes scanning the security cameras with a twitchy, predatory focus. He wasn't there to cook, he was there to harvest a soul. The assassin realized his cover was blown the moment Amara's hand left the teapot. He didn't hesitate. Reaching into his white tunic, he pulled a ceramic blade, designed to bypass the manor's metal detectors, and lunged across the central island. The movement was a blur of lethal intent, a strike aimed directly at Amara's throat to silence the witness before finishing the job on the mother. But Amara was no longer the invisible servant the world ignored. She was a woman who had lived in the friction of survival, her reflexes honed by years of being the underdog, who had to see the blow before it landed. As the assassin vaulted over the counter, Amara didn't scream. She didn't retreat. She reached for the nearest weight she could find, a heavy, seasoned cast-iron skillet resting on the range. The clang of metal on bone echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. Amara pivoted, using the momentum of her entire body to swing the iron across the assassin's trajectory. The impact was visceral, a sickening thud as the skillet met the side of his skull. He collapsed midair, his ceramic blade skittering across the floor like a useless shard of glass. Before he could scramble for a secondary weapon, Amara was on him. She didn't use the skillet again, she used the environment. She slammed his head against the edge of the industrial freezer, her face a mask of cold, righteous fury. This wasn't just a fight for her life. It was a defense of the fragile woman upstairs who finally felt safe. "You chose the wrong house," Amara whispered, her voice a low, dangerous vibration as she pinned him to the floor with a knee to his chest. Within seconds, the kitchen doors hissed open. Tae-Hyuk stood there, his obsidian eyes taking in the scene. The spilled tea, the unconscious assassin, and Amara, standing over the threat with a heavy iron pan and a gaze that burned with a moral fire he had only ever seen in his dreams. He didn't ask what happened. He saw the tea set and the scent of almonds, and for the first time, he realized that the nobody he had hired was the only thing standing between his empire and total ruin. The scent of cyanide was replaced by the smell of ozone and iron, the scent of a war that had finally reached the heart of the fortress. Amara looked at the architect of shadows and saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for the mother she had just saved. The maid was gone, the guardian had arrived. The high-tech hum of the Tae-Hyuk estate, usually a comforting pulse of absolute security, vanished with a sickening, heavy thud. In an instant, the clinical white light of the corridors was swallowed by a tomb-like darkness. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the frantic thrumming of Amara's pulse, but then the silence was shattered by the distant, rhythmic staccato of suppressed gunfire and the muffled boom of breaching charges. The Park Syndicate hadn't just arrived. They were dismantling the fortress from the inside out. Amara didn't wait for the emergency red lights to flicker to life. She knew that in this darkness, Tae-Hyuk's high-tech defenses were now blind, leaving the manor a hollow shell of glass and steel. She bolted toward Madame Han's suite, her memory of the floor plan, vivid and architectural, serving as her only compass. She found the elderly woman huddled in the center of her bed, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended her fading memory. "The boy," Soo-jin whimpered, clutching Amara's arm with surprising strength. "We have to find the boy." "I have him, mother," Amara lied softly, her voice a steady anchor in the rising chaos. "But we have to move, now." She didn't head for the main elevators or the grand staircase where the tactical teams would be funneling. Instead, she pressed a hidden seam in the obsidian paneling behind the vanity, a secret Tae-Hyuk had shown her after the kitchen assassination attempt. The wall slid back with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a narrow, concrete artery that smelled of damp stone and cold air. This was the maze, a network of tunnels built for a king to escape his own shadow. As they descended into the lightless belly of the manor, the sounds of the raid changed. The screams and gunfire above became a dull, rhythmic vibration through the concrete. Amara became the sovereign of this subterranean world. She navigated the labyrinth by touch and instinct, leading the trembling Soo-jin through junctions that felt like the chambers of a frozen heart. Behind them, she could hear the metallic ring of boots on the service stairs. The hunters were close, their thermal goggles cutting through the gloom. "Keep your eyes on me," Amara whispered, her hand never leaving Soo-jin's. They reached a pressurized steel door that marked the exit to the lower perimeter, but a sudden shadow blocked the way. A syndicate mercenary, silhouetted by a tactical flashlight, stepped into the corridor. The beam blinded them, catching the silver of Soo-jin's hair like a target. Amara didn't hesitate. She didn't have the obsidian power of Tae-Hyuk, but she had the desperate, focused ferocity of a guardian. She thrust Soo-jin into a recessed alcove and lunged. The fight was a blur of claustrophobic violence, the narrow walls stripping away the mercenaries' advantage of reach. Amara used the concrete itself, slamming the man's head into the jagged stone until the flashlight fell and flickered out. In the sudden return of the dark, Amara stood over the fallen hunter, her breathing ragged, her white apron stained with the soot of the tunnels. She reached back for Soo-jin's hand, her grip as firm as a vow. Above them, the architect's empire was burning, but here, in the cold veins of the earth, the nobody had become the only law that mattered. She pushed open the final door, the night air of the Seoul hills rushing in to meet them. They had breached the maze, and for the first time in her life, Amara Nwoye wasn't just surviving the world, she was leading the way through it. The Shilla Hotel had rebuilt its glass and gold, but it could not erase the memory of the night the architect's mother was broken on its floors. 6 months had passed since the raid, 6 months since the manor's obsidian walls had been scorched by fire and betrayal. Tonight, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open, not with a hesitant creak, but with the thunderous resonance of a new era. The scent of rare orchids and underlying rot was gone, replaced by the crisp, sharp ozone of a storm that had already cleared the air. Jang Tae-Hyuk stepped into the light, his presence no longer that of a solitary ghost, but of a king who had found his foundation. He moved with the same predatory grace, his tailored black suit a shadow against the fractured gold of the chandeliers. But as the elite of Seoul held their breath, expecting the cold terror of the old regime, they saw the unthinkable. Tae-Hyuk was not alone. Beside him, her hand resting firmly on his arm, walked Amara Nwoye. She did not wear the white apron of a servant or the hesitant gaze of an outsider. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light like a living forest, her posture upright and regal. Her dark eyes swept the room, the same room that had once treated her as background noise. And this time, the diamonds of the socialite seemed to dim in the face of her steady, moral fire. They weren't looking at a maid. They were looking at the woman who had navigated the maze, survived the cyanide, and held the architect's soul together when it was nothing but shards. At the center of the room, Choi Min-seo stood frozen, her glass rattling against her saucer as Tae-Hyuk and Amara approached. The socialite tried to offer a shallow, trembling smile, but Tae-Hyuk's gaze pinned her to the spot, a look of such icy, predatory focus that she seemed to physically wither. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The city's elite realized then that the ghost of Seoul was no longer a solitary monster. He had found a moral center that made his empire more impenetrable than any iron gate. "Shall we dance, Amara?" Tae-Hyuk whispered, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. "I thought you didn't dance, Mr. Jang," she teased, her voice steady and warm, a stark contrast to the hollow whispers of the crowd. "For the woman who saved my world, I make exceptions," he replied, leading her onto the floor. As they spun under the golden lights, the king and the queen of Seoul became a united front of power and mercy. The man who owned the judges and the woman who owned his heart moved in a perfect, silent rhythm, proving that the greatest empire isn't built on fear, but on the courage of a single heart that refuses to look away. Behind them, in a quiet corner guarded by men who now looked at Amara with genuine reverence, Madame Han sat in a velvet chair, a small, knowing smile on her face. The fog hadn't vanished, but the fear had. The architect of shadows had finally built something that could not be broken, a home within the heart of a storm.